All right, I believe I'm recording. Yep. All right, I want to welcome everybody to our PolarConnect event today. Today is July 8th, 2019. This is Janet Warburton from the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States, and I'm based in Anchorage, Alaska today. I'm hosting this event, and it's co-hosted with my colleague Judy Fonstock, who is somewhere in a cabin in Maine, I hear. And we are joined today with our PolarTREC teacher, Amanda Ruland, and she'll introduce us to a team member or two someplace in Siberia, which I'm really excited to hear all about and hear all about their research on fire and carbon in the forest. Before we turn this over to Amanda, if you haven't already started to do so, please introduce yourself in the chat area so we get an idea of who is joining us and where you're joining us from. And whoops, skipped along there. A little background about what is PolarTREC. I see a number of friendly faces in the virtual land there, so I know many of you are familiar with PolarTREC, but for those of you that aren't, it's a program that's administered by ARCIS, and we are a nonprofit that's based in Fairbanks, Alaska, although many of the employees are situated around the United States. The PolarTREC program is funded by the National Science Foundation, and it places teachers like Amanda and informal science educators with researchers in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And our whole effort is to help educators get hands-on practical experience working with scientists so they can take it back to their learning situations and share it with the people that they work with and educate. During this presentation, as we have questions or as you have questions, you can ask them live at the end, but if it's during the middle of the presentation, we ask that you just post your question in the chat area. And Judy and I will try to interrupt Amanda and let her know about those questions if it's as we're going along. If not, again, we'll have time at the end for you to ask your questions live. And I think that's it. I'm actually going to skip these slides for you, Amanda, and just get to the your opening slide. Oh, well, this is our great cohort and all of the teachers. Amanda's somewhere in there. I actually can't see it. Oh, far.
Yeah, so I have a few things to say about this. So if you want to go back. Yeah, so for PolarTREC, the people that aren't familiar with it, Janet told you a bit about it, but it is an acronym, so teachers and researchers exploring and collaborating, and that's really a great way to sum up, I think, the whole program. And so on the next slide, you can see the whole cohort for 2019. And there are formal and informal educators. So I'm one of the formal educators, but there are several informal educators as well on our in our cohort this year. And so not everyone in the cohort is going to Siberia. In fact, I'm the only one, but on the next slide, you can see kind of the distribution of the PolarTREC teachers. So you can see up in the upper right is our Siberian team, but then on the left we had several teachers go to Alaska this year, and then we will be having several teachers going to Antarctica later this year. So I think that's going to be really, really cool too. On the next slide is the link to see information on any expedition, not necessarily just ours. This will link you to any expedition that PolarTREC teachers are currently doing or that they have done in the past. So that's all archived in there as well. On the next slide, if you're looking specifically for information on our PolarTREC experience, you're going to be looking for the title Fire and Carbon in Siberian Forests. So that's our focus here in Siberia. So just to kind of start on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the differences between Antarctic and Arctic and kind of iron out maybe some of those misconceptions that people may have. And I teach elementary school students, so oftentimes there are misconceptions about Arctic and Antarctica. I'm not really sure who's in our audience today, so I am going to briefly touch on that a bit. So when you're looking at Antarctic versus Arctic, you'll notice that Antarctica is a continent surrounded by water, whereas the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by continents. So they're kind of opposite in that way. Also, if you look down at the thermometers, you'll see that Antarctica is quite a bit colder than the Arctic. So Antarctica is going to get much colder. And if you look down farther, you'll see that there are far more animals in the Arctic than there are in Antarctica. So different animals too. The Arctic is where you're going to find brown bears. If you go up farther enough, polar bears. There's quite a bit of boreal forests, which is where we focus our science here. And caribou, small mammals, you're going to find all of those in the Arctic. There are no penguins in the Arctic, so that's one misconception that young children often have. And there are also people that live here year-round in the Arctic. It is very remote, and there aren't very many, but they do live here year-round. Whereas in Antarctica, all the people that you'll find are researchers living on at different stations. So those are some of the differences between Arctic versus Antarctica. And if we go down, there is one more animal that is very prevalent in the Arctic. And so on the next slide, you'll see some friendly, oh, did it change?
Sorry, I was having mouse issues. I think we're there now. And I have to get rid of this.
There it is. Line. Yes. So the other animal that you'll see a lot of are insects. So mosquitoes, particularly, and black flies, lots and lots of them. So this nifty garment is called a bug shirt, and it's hard to survive without one here when you're doing field research. This is one of our researchers' heads, and it's completely covered with mosquitoes, so pretty yucky. But the bug shirt does a great job in preventing them from biting you. On the next slide, I want to get a little bit into kind of where exactly we're located on the globe. So there we go. So that red dotted circle is the Arctic Circle, and that red arrow points to Cherskii. So Cherskii is in Siberia, and it is within the Arctic Circle. And if you look at that map, you'll notice that it's really not very far from Alaska, but unfortunately, we can't fly around the globe that way, so it takes us much longer to get there. On the next slide, here's another map, kind of a side view. And you can see that it really is quite close to Alaska in distance. But on the next slide, you'll see this was kind of my flight path to get to Cherskii. So I went from Laramie, Wyoming to Denver to JFK, New York, and then to Moscow, and then to Yakutsk, and then to Cherskii, which I believe is 18 time zones. It's a lot. We almost circumnavigated the globe. So it was quite far. It took several days, I think 5 days total after we were done all our traveling. So it was quite a distance away. All right, on the next slide, so something really interesting is when you're moving up in latitude, you're going to see very similar biomes as to when you're moving up in elevation. So those of you joining us from maybe Rocky Mountain regions may recognize that as you're moving up in elevation, you're going to see more conifers and eventually tundra. And we're going to get a very similar distribution here in the Arctic as well. So Cherskii, for instance, is right in that taiga area. And so we are specifically looking at larch trees here in the Arctic. All right, so where are we as far as where are we staying? If you look at the next slide, we are staying at the Northeast Science Station. And so this building is called Orbita, and it's an old Russian satellite. It was an old radio station, and it was converted into a science station. And so this building is where we eat all of our meals and spend all of our community time. And so this building is actually, Northeast Science Station is run by the same people who are running Pleistocene Park. And so anyone who maybe has seen that 60-minute segment, it's the same people that run this science station. All right, on the next slide. So this is what it looks like inside, and this is actually where we are right now. So there are some long tables where everyone eats. There's a brown bear pelt strung across the couch. There is a freezer full of ice cream all the time, which is dangerous. And yeah, it's cozy. It's a round room. So this is where we spend all of our meals, and meal times are non-negotiable. So they're always at 8:30 a.m., 2 p.m., and 8:30 p.m. is dinner every single day. So we always see our team and then all the other scientists that are on campus as well, which is pretty cool. And we get to talk about what they're doing here as well. On the next slide, there we go. So this is a view of the science station kind of down the main street that runs through the station. There's a lot of different housing. Some of the housing is in Orbita, but there's other housing throughout the Northeast Science Station. So the building on the left is actually the soils lab, where a lot of soil processing takes place. But on the right, there is one home, and then up that road further, there are more housing establishments. Some of them are lived in by just families and people, but most of them are currently occupied by scientists. Okay, on the next slide. So because the Arctic is so remote, oftentimes things are brought here and they don't go anywhere. They stay here forever because it's just, it would take too many resources to remove them from the Arctic. So this is just an old abandoned ship that is in the Inui, and we walk past it every day, and it just sits there, and this is one of several. So you'll see all sorts of kind of different artifacts and ships and planes and things kind of rusting away in the Arctic. On the next slide, so it's incredibly bright this time of year in the Arctic. The summer solstice was on June 21st, and that was the longest day of the year. And so this picture was taken at midnight on the solstice. And, you know, the sun kind of skates across the horizon, and then it rises back up above, you know, up into the sky without ever truly setting. And so on the next slide, the reason why this happens, as many of you probably already know, is the rotation of the Earth on its axis. So during the summer months, the sun's rays are hitting the Arctic in its entirety, day and night. And then if you look on the right-hand side, in the winter months, the sun is not hitting the Arctic at all. So those summer months, you're getting almost 24 hours of sunlight every day, whereas in the winter months, you're getting the complete opposite of darkness. All right, on the next slide. Maybe. Oh, there we go. I included a collage of just wildflowers that are growing in our area. So thinking again of similarities between an increase in latitude and an increase in elevation, you're going to see many of the same forbs and flowers. So fireweed being an example of a flower that you would see in Wyoming, which is high elevation, and also in Cherskii, which is high latitude, but still the same flower. Okay, the next slide. So many of the locations where our science team collected data, on the next slide, we had to travel quite far to get there. And so we spent about a week of our time living on this barge. And then we took those small motorboats off to the side of the barge to get specifically to our science sites, the places where we were going to collect data. So on the next slide, you'll see some pictures of what it looked like on the inside. So in this slide, for those of you that participated in the Fly Your Flag in the Arctic competition, this is where we strung the flags on the barge. So they were hanging over our doorway in our eating area. And in the next slide,
it's showing up.
This is what the barge looks like. It just popped up for me. Sorry. So this is what it looked like this is what it looks like going kind of down the corridor on the barge. So bedrooms are off to the left and the right. There is a sauna at the end, showers, bathroom, all on the barge. All right, the next slide. So as I said, we took those small motorboats out to different locations, and there are plenty of dogs in Siberia. Many of them are wild, but there are also many pet dogs. And so these dogs came to visit us. They were fishermen's dogs, and they really didn't want to leave. So they hopped on the front of the boats and just wanted to hang out with us. On the next picture, you'll see another shot of kind of a nighttime view. Still, the sun is quite bright, and so we were able to work very late because it was so bright. Okay, on the next slide. So this is a calendar I use to keep track of the weather during our time in Siberia, and as you can see, Arctic summers are not cold, despite popular belief. Most days hovered around 80 degrees, and they were quite sunny. So overall, the Arctic summers are quite warm. It also doesn't rain here very often, and so you'll see that limited precipitation also in the winter months, so we don't get very much snow here either. Okay, in the next slide, you're going to see a distribution of boreal forests across the Arctic, and boreal forests, larch forests specifically, were the focus of this science team. So this is just a distribution across the Arctic, but we were focusing our time in boreal forests. In the next slide, you'll see our team collecting data. In the background, you can see what a live larch forest looks like. Where the scientists are standing right now. Oh, that's a different slide than I have, but that's okay. So yes, this is what a larch forest looks like. However, this one I believe is lower in latitude than where we were, because these larch trees are much larger, and typically where we are in the Arctic, the trees are much more stunted because the conditions are much harsher. So these larch trees are pretty huge, and the trees that we saw weren't quite this big. All right, on the next slide, something really interesting about larch are that they're deciduous conifers. So deciduous conifers being that their needles change color and they drop to the ground, and then they grow new needles just like any other deciduous tree would do, but that's very unique for conifers. So on the next slide, another unique characteristic of larch is that they grow on permafrost. So permafrost is frozen soil that froze during the last ice age and has remained frozen. And there's a special permafrost that exists here called yedema. And yedema is really important because it developed during the Pleistocene era and it contains tons of organic matter. And it's estimated that the amount of greenhouse gases that are in the yedema in the Arctic is double what is in the atmosphere right now. So if that were to melt, that would be a really bad thing.
Hey, Amanda. Amanda?
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of questions that came up, and I'd like to go back before you get too far into your science, because some of them deal with the last few slides. Okay. So let's see, kind of going back to the science station and about the science station, how many scientists are there and what kind of science are they doing?
So it's fluctuated quite a bit since we've been here. I think at one point there were probably about 30 scientists, 20 or 30 scientists, and they're all doing different research. Some of them are focusing on the permafrost. Some of them are traveling up and down the rivers following carbon. Some of them are doing soils. It really just depends. There's a lot of variation between all the different scientists. But yeah, it's been pretty fun.
Are they coming from Russia or other countries? Or
all over. So Germany, quite a few scientists from Germany. Where else did we have scientists from?
Mostly Germany and Russia. And
Russia,
the US.
Yeah. Mostly.
Related to your flower pictures, have you seen very many pollinators with the flowers, and if so, what kind?
Mosquitoes. Lots of mosquitoes. Bees, yeah, some bees, but not many. Some butterflies, but not a ton.
Okay. You had a picture of the, I think this was on the barge, and I can't remember which picture, but it said there was a gentleman in the foreground, the man who started Pleistocene Park and was featured on 60 Minutes. Oh, was that person, that guy that was featured? You had a picture of somebody on the barge? Yes, okay.
Yes, Sergey. So he was driving the boat. The dog, the picture with the dogs, that was the man. Yep.
Okay. And and maybe you're getting to this, what kind of research were you doing on the barge?
Yeah, so I'm about to go into all the research that we were doing, and there's so our team is pretty big. We have 10, 11?
There's about 5 universities and
just
10 or 11 people.
Yeah, so we have 11 people on our team, and they're all kind of working in different pieces of the science puzzle. So I'll go into that a little bit right now.
One question. One more question before you go. Are there larch forests in the U.S.?
There are larch forests in the U.S., but they're a different kind of larch.
Okay. All right. Let's go into the, most of the rest deal with the larch, and the science that you're collecting. So let's go to that, and then we'll come back to these other questions if I didn't get them.
Excellent. Okay, so on the next slide, I forgot. In the previous slide, that big tool is a thaw depth probe. And so every year there's a layer of the soil that does thaw out, and that's called the active layer. But then there's a layer below that remains frozen. And so the thaw depth probe can measure how deep that active layer is thawing from year to year. You can use it to collect data on that. Okay, on the next slide. So this is what one example of what a larch forest would look like after a burn. And this is what we were specifically looking at. So the team was looking at different conditions, and just like any plant, large trees need those just right conditions to be successful in growing. And so the team was looking at different aspects of post-fire sites to see what those just right conditions were and what the situation was at those post-fire sites. So in the next picture, you'll see some of our team members. And so several of our team members were working on pieces of that puzzle to explain how large forests are responding to increased fire severity. So in the Arctic, fires are becoming more severe and more frequent, and we're looking into how larch are responding to that. So starting at the top left, we have Sarah Frankenberg looking at mycorrhizae, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a moment. Dr. Jennie DeMarco is investigating soil and nutrients in that soil in the next picture. And then we have Dr. Allison Paulson looking at seed dispersal. And we have Dr. Michael Laranti looking at spatial patterns of larch forests. Seth Robinson was looking at seed predation, so what kind of predators might be eating the larch seeds. And at the bottom right is a picture of the whole team, not the whole team, but several members of the team working on dendrology processing as well. So looking at wood slabs and the tree rings as well. In the next slide, so another member of our team, Eric Borth, he was doing a lot of that dendrology stuff, but last year he was looking a lot into the cones of the larch trees and counting them. And so this year is actually a masting year. And so a masting year is when the trees create a lot of cones. So every year, they create a certain number of cones, but then every couple of years, they create a whole bunch of cones. And so one theory for this is that if the trees kind of flood the environment with all of these seeds, predators will eat some of the seeds, but then there'll still be seeds left over to germinate and grow into new trees. And some other trees that do this are nut trees like pecan trees. In the next slide, so these are some tree cores that Eric collected, and they were taken with an increment borer. So it's a special tool that kind of bores a hole into the tree and then removes a small cylinder from the center, and you can see all the different rings on that slab, and then you have to sand it down so it's really nice and clear, and then you can really count those rings, and it doesn't kill the tree. On the next slide, so we used a program called Windendro, and this counts the tree rings for you. So it saves a lot of time in that respect. It takes a long time to scan everything in, but it saves a lot of time when it comes to actually counting. And the main reason we do this is because we can't bring all of the wood samples home with us. And so we scan them all into the computer, and then we bring the data back as opposed to all of the slabs of wood. On the next slide, so this is Dr. Allison Paulson, and she's using ArcGIS, which is a mapping tool, and she's identifying different transects where we could then gather data. So she looks for very specific criteria when she's looking for those transects, where the whole team will then gather their specific data at that one location, and then we'll relocate, and the whole team will gather their specific data at that location. On the next slide, so Dr. Allison Paulson is also working on a seed trap experiment. So she wants to see kind of how far those large tree seeds can travel. They travel by wind, so she made these boxes, and she's setting them out all around the forest that we have been investigating, and she's going to go back and see how far out those seeds were able to travel.
In the next picture, there's just a different angle of some more of those seed traps and a lot of other supplies that we used for exclosures, and I have a picture of that coming up. So in the next slide, so another part of the project was simulating burns so that we could kind of have that more controlled environment as to different severity levels. And so the idea was to burn the soil organic layers at these different plots and then put larch seeds down and see how they grow. Unfortunately, the organic layer was really, really wet. So the science team had to improvise, and we removed all the organic layer, brought it to the saunas, dried everything out, put it back in the plots, burned it, and then we're able to put the seeds down. So hopefully next year we'll have some data on that. In the next picture, so these are two different kinds of exclosures to keep predators out, to see if that is a key factor in larch recruitment, to see if they're struggling because of those predators. So these were just two different kinds. So the one on the left, Seth was working on, and then the one on the right, Allie was working on. If we go down one more slide, so Dr. Heather Alexander is studying the carbon in the larch forest. So she's collecting data specifically related to that. So she goes around and measures all the live vegetation to determine the amount of carbon sequestered in it. And she also collects data to calculate the amount of carbon lost during larch fires. And so there's a lot of different elements to that, a lot of different data that she's collecting to then be able to do those calculations. If we go down one more, so this is me helping collect data or record data at one of the transects. And so on the right is one of the notebook pages that I filled out. And so in the upper left, that's densiometer readings. And densiometer is just a small tool that measures cover, canopy cover. Some of the other things we were looking at were coarse woody debris. And so all those tally marks are different sizes of coarse woody debris. We were also looking at vegetation cover. So all that data at the bottom is vegetation cover, northeast, northwest, just different directions. And we did this at every transect throughout, and there were lots and lots of transects. Okay, if we go down one more, so there are areas with a lot of larch recruitment, establishment after fire, and there are some areas with far less recruitment. And so Sarah Frankenberg is looking at the immediate surrounding area of larch recruitment, and more specifically, she's looking into fungi that can be found on the larch roots. And these are called mycorrhizae. And so these mycorrhizae have a symbiotic relationship with the larch, in that the fungi, so the larch provide the fungi with sugars, and the fungi provide the larch with the ability to absorb nutrients. So they have a really important kind of relationship with each other. And so she's looking into that specifically. So she's gathering all these samples of larch recruits and then looking very detailed at their roots under a microscope to look at the mycorrhizae. On the next slide, so this is a point intercept grid, and it's used to collect specific data on vegetation. And so we were using these for a variety of data collection, but specifically we were using them to then be used in turn with nutrient soil analysis as well. If we go down one more, so Mike Loranti and Elena Forbeth were looking at spatial patterns in post-burn areas. And so they were using a drone, which was really fun and cool. And so they were looking at multispectral data, and they actually, so they put out points, which then were recorded by the drone. It was a very sophisticated drone that they could plot and map exactly where they wanted it to fly, and then it would follow the route and record exactly what they wanted. And so they'll analyze that data when we get back. On the next slide, so here Dr. DeMarco is looking at soil composition and carbon content, and I'm also archiving some of her samples for later use as well. And then let's see, one more down. So Dr. DeMarco is also executing an experiment looking at competition. So if different vegetation is removed, will larch grow better? So, you know, if we have grass and shrubs and larch, if you remove just the grass, is it going to grow better? If you remove just the shrubs, is it going to grow? Or maybe not better, but is it going to change the plot? If you remove both of those types of vegetation, is it going to change? And if you have any specific questions about that, I'm sure she can shed more light for you. She is here. And then on the final slide, this is our whole Siberian team. And although we spent many hours looking at larch recruitments in Siberia in post-fire burn areas, we did find some time to go hiking as well. And I'm not sure if you, there it is. And this was on the 4th of July. So we hiked up to a place called Rodinka, and it's an old Soviet satellite. And yeah, it was a great team to work with. That's all I have for you. Do you have any additional questions?
Hi, Amanda, this is Judy. And we have quite a few questions for you. And we'd also be thrilled if Jennie would join in on answering any of them. We'd love to see Jennie on screen also, your researcher.
Definitely.
So we'll start out with, let's see, how about, is it warmer now than it used to be in the summer there?
No, it's actually cooled down a bit, but it's been fluctuating quite a bit. But when we first came here, from what we heard from the people at the station, it was a heat wave. It was hotter than usual, and it's cooled down a bit, but not much. It's 70s Fahrenheit.
How about Jennie? How many years have you done this research, and are you seeing changes in temperatures?
Well, this is only my second summer, and I think overall we're seeing gradual increases in temperature in this area, but this is only my second summer, and it definitely was cooler last summer. So,
yeah, and it's hard to. I mean, you can't really look at that small pool of data to really say, like, you have to look a little bit vaster to see if it's really changing. And so, I don't think we've really been here.
But in general, across the Arctic, we're seeing about 2 to 3 times faster warming than the rest of the globe.
And following up with that, we have a question from Nora Lee. Is there permafrost in this area? And if so, is there information of it melting?
Yes. Yes and yes. So this entire area is sitting on top of permafrost. And so anywhere you go, we test the active layers of that permafrost to kind of see how it's melting, and it is melting. You can actually see a lot of larch forests kind of slipping off the permafrost because how rapidly it is melting.
Mm-hmm.
So just to add to this, this region is unique in that there's a lot of what we call ice wedges, which are like icebergs in the soil. They're like wedges of ice in between the soil, and so when those melt, you get subsidence, so the soil kind of falls into that open space, and we get ground subsidence. And so we're seeing a lot of that. Many of the dirt roads around here have kind of fallen in and make it hard to drive. And many of the buildings have kind of subsided due to that, what we call karsting from those ice wedges melting.
Making it more challenging to drive there.
Yes,
definitely. From Leslie. Is there a concern that as the permafrost melts, microorganisms that haven't been seen in thousands of years will be released?
So yes, that is an issue, is that microorganisms that have been frozen in the soil will then become active. Whether they have pathogens or could cause harm is still up to debate whether that could be a problem.
Rob Wilson asks, how could the soil bore be used in the classroom? Probably for lessons and instructions. You have ideas?
Yeah. So when you look at the whole process of kind of extracting or looking at the organic matter and, you know, putting it in a drying unit and then in a muffle furnace, I think there's kind of a simulation, if you don't have that specific equipment, that you could still follow the sequences of to get the point across and look at kind of how much carbon would be within that soil. So I think that's something that I definitely want to investigate further, and I hope to be writing some lesson plans kind of aligned with that. So stay tuned.
Great. Amanda Piper, another PolarTREC teacher, asked, is this long-term data? Have these scientists been collecting this data over a period of time to compare differences by year?
Yeah, so we have 2 members on our team that this is their 9th year coming to Northeast Science Station. And do we have anyone who's been coming longer than that isn't here right now?
Well, there was a German scientist who's been coming for 17 years.
Yeah, he's not with our team, but
yeah.
he has been coming for 17 years. And so this area definitely has had long-term data collection. And Sergey, who kind of runs the whole gamut, he has been collecting data since 70s. Mm-hmm. He's been doing it for quite a long time, so.
And I had a question, sort of after a masting year, do they see an increase in squirrels and rodents and that kind of small mammals?
Yeah, that's a good question. So some of our team members did set up some game cameras, and I think they're still going through some of that data. So it would be interesting to kind of see what they come across, but I'm not sure.
Leslie asks, will you get to bring home some wood sections for use in your classroom?
I hope to. So I don't have a permit to, but I hope to be able to maybe bring one. I don't know. We'll see.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. How about, what are the main predators that your exclusion traps are keeping out?
Mostly birds is, the main predator of the larch seed.
Okay. Do you have ideas what kind of birds you're seeing, Jenny and Amanda?
I'm not a very good bird person, but we do also have Arctic ground squirrels, which would also eat the seeds.
Yeah, we haven't. There weren't any ground squirrels caught on the game cams, but they definitely are. They would be something that potentially could eat the seeds. Yes, also mice, any kind of small rodents, but. So we have some data on different birds as far as pictures go, but I don't think they've been identified yet.
Okay. We have a question from Leslie. Do your team members return to these sites every year? So how long is your study, Jenny? Is it a 3-year study, or do you hope to continue?
So the study, yeah, good question. The study is funded for 4 years by NSF. We're kind of doing multiple things. So the sites that we're going to on the river and the barge, we just go once because it's hard to get to, but we do have some sites that we measure around the station that we go to frequently. And our lead PI, Heather Alexander, has been going to some of those sites, measuring seedlings for, over the last 6 or 7 years.
Wow. From Nora Lee, she says, I'm interested in what they've learned about competition among plants on the land where there is or recently has been permafrost.
Yeah, so the competition experiment was just set up this year. So I think we're we're excited to collect data on that and kind of see.
Yeah, right now we don't have a lot of information about competition, and we have some data suggests that when we have more grasses, we have less larch seedlings emerging. So that suggests there might be some maybe competition with light or nutrients. And so that's what part of our experiment is, just trying to collect some of that data. And just another thing with permafrost is this area is what we call continuous permafrost. So the under the soil, we have permafrost that is covering the entire area, versus if we move further south, we have discontinuous permafrost, where we might have permafrost in some areas, but not in other areas. And we're not sure right now the relationship between sort of permafrost thaw and competition with large seedlings and grasses and shrubs.
Okay. Kind of in that same vein, Rob Wilson was asking, are there any phenology records for the region? Or is it just what you're doing now? Is that the beginning of them?
That's a great question. There hasn't really been any consistent phenology measurements, and that is something we should try to kind of do more in the future.
Okay. Leslie's asking, are any of the researchers studying these microorganisms? So I guess microorganisms that you're finding.
So nobody on our team is directly measuring or looking at the microorganisms. We do have our graduate student, Sarah, who's looking at Mycorrhizae. So this is fungi that has an association with larch roots and can help with nutrient and water uptake. But nobody specifically on our team is looking at microorganisms. But there are other researchers here from Germany and that are looking at some aspect of the bacterial community.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we have got great questions. Oh, we're starting to, I think they're wrapping up here. We've got from Nora Lee, as permafrost melts in other areas, there have been studies about soil chemistry changes due to composition. Is there any evidence of this enriching the soil for plant growth positively or negatively?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the permafrost here is a specific type of soil called yedema, and actually has a high amount of nutrients compared to what we call the active layer. And so when permafrost thaws, we do get a release of nitrogen, which is one of the main elements that plants need for photosynthesis. And so in Arctic systems, plants' growth is limited by their availability to get nitrogen. And so when we have permafrost thawing, specifically if there's yedema soils, it releases a lot of nitrogen, which can help stimulate plant growth.
All right. Finally, it's owner is asking, are there any glaciers in the area at all? Or it sounds like mostly permafrost, and are they melting?
So, yeah, go ahead and do it.
Well, so we didn't see any glaciers.
Yeah, so this area has not been glaciated for a very long time, so we don't have active glaciers like we would in other regions of the Arctic.
All right. I think that wraps up most of the questions. People are able at this point to turn on their video if they want. And if people have other questions, either type them in or you might be able to ask them directly to Amanda and Jenny.
Great presentation, you two. While we're waiting for people to do questions, there was definitely some applause, some virtual applause going on over there. And can you tell us, I had asked you earlier, but can you tell us a little bit about what happens next? How long are you at the station, and where are you headed? When do you get home, and all that good stuff?
Sure, yeah. So today is actually our last day at the station, and then we'll head to Yakutsk. There'll be a flight there tomorrow. Part of the team is actually leaving today, and then part of the team will leave tomorrow, and we'll do some data entry, stuff there, and then we will fly to Moscow. And if all goes according to plan, then we'll have a day, hopefully, in Moscow.
Amanda's first day off the entire time.
and then we will go to, I'll fly to JFK, New York, and then I will fly to Denver, and yes, eventually make it home.
Eventually.
But yeah, one more day.
A long, long day. The long, long day that never ends. Very good.
I'll be going back in time, so that'll be cool. It's a day ahead. Yes.
That is funny. Well, while we're sitting here, I'm going to put up a poll for our viewers. So I appreciate you filling out this poll. And while people are filling out the poll, there was a question from Jennifer, and she was asking, is the Russian government supportive of this research?
Yeah, very. So we're actually the only team currently from America that is doing research here in Siberia. So they're very supportive of having us here, and they want us to be able to keep coming to continue that relationship.
And just to add, I think it was just last week, Putin acknowledged that we do have permafrost in Russia and that it is a problem in terms of its impact on climate change. And so that was a huge kind of stepping stone to thinking about as a country, you know, how we think about permafrost.
Cool. And then just for everybody that's also viewing, I forgot to mention that we are recording this event and it will be archived, so you can share it with others, and it will probably take a couple of days for that to happen, but we'll send a link out by email as well as post on the website. And then another thing we wanted to mention is that we do have, as Amanda shared, the cohort and all the teachers and educators that are in this group, we have more educators heading out to the field. So as she's coming home, there'll be somebody en route. Monica is heading up to the North Slope. She's from Texas, and we're pretty excited about Monica's expedition. It's also looking at plants and plant phenology and kind of implications on climate change. She will be doing journals in English and in Spanish, so that will be a nice feature to have. And yeah, if there are other questions, feel free to ask them. I do see somebody says they can't see the poll. It might be on a separate pop-up window behind the main screen. You may have to shrink, get out of, yeah, I don't know, zoom in small, or get out of the full screen mode. Yeah, good presentation, very interesting. We don't have very many larch in Alaska. We do see them, but not like over there. It's really fascinating. And I think it's a different species, is that right?
Yeah, do you know the distribution of the larch that you're specifically studying? Is there any of that specific larch in the US, or is it just northern Russia?
Yeah, I don't think the species is in the US.
Very interesting.
All right, well, we'll give it a few more minutes here for the poll. And again, thank you all for joining us today. If you're online, feel free to say hello and say thank you. I'm gonna stop our recording in the meantime here. And